very proud of you. Earthlings, greetings. I'm here today to talk about my response to, let me just get the better one, to this.
Can you tell me what the most beautiful sound, or the most interesting sound that you've ever heard is?
No.
What's your favourite sound? No, my favourite sound is no to Lawrence Pollard's unfortunate question. This interview took place in 2005 for BBC Two TV's Culture Show. Lawrence said afterwards that it had started badly. This means he thought it got better. His second question was, do you hum tunes?
So what do you think about melody? Do you hum tunes like we all do?
Absolutely,
Do you
whistle
whistle?
a lot.
What do you whistle?
Well, the melodies that I write.
Your own stuff?
Yes.
Do you like to whistle anyone else's, sort of Mozart or Bach people? Or?
Mozart, when I conducted Mozart. I conducted several works for records, etc. Then I whistled also these Mozart works.
Faced with this disastrous interview, the post-production team tried to turn the feature around to portray Stockhausen rather than their interviewer as incomprehensible, sort of disconnected, not quite compos mentis, not quite with it, not quite au courant. They're the kind of people who debate who is the greatest composer, Ludovico Einaudi or Max Richter. They sort of caught up. I was caught up in a similar anti-Stockhausen stunt 7 years prior to that interview. On BBC Two, The Late Show wanted to mock the modernist music policy of the Southbank Centre as it was under Nicholas Snowman. They wanted me to skulk around the doors and stairways of the South Bank on camera, counting the audience entering a Stockhausen concert to show how small it was. When the editor learned that the concert had in fact sold out, he gave up. The editor, by the way, was Roly Keating, who moved on to become CEO of the British Library and a knight. So tonight I am settling my score with those. Thank you very much.
Would you take yours?
No, I might need them in defense. I'm not used to grasses, you see. Tonight I'm settling my score with those corporation enemies of complexity and timbral innovation. But not only them. My title, Without Wires and at the Speed of Light, comes out of a book that was written in the year 1928 when Stockhausen was born. The author was an employee of the newly founded BBC, Arthur Burroughs. He was the first person to read a BBC news bulletin on air, where his job was actually director of programmes. I'd like to see them do that today. Burroughs wrote this handsome expression, without wires at the speed of light, to refer to the new world then of the radio and its radial power of transmission and reception. But I find that it also reminds me of the condition of much of Stockhausen's music. And I'm not the only one, because Stockhausen's biographer, Robin McConey, also uses the phrase of Burroughs in this way. Arthur Burroughs will surely recognise these sounds in Stockhausen that emerge as radio signals and static distant voices, slightly fuzzy and mutated, and eventually transformed, reflected from space and reflecting it. Robin McConey writes of Stockhausen as a boy in Nazi Germany, searching on a radio for the forbidden sounds of American popular music, such as swing bands. The mature Stockhausen rejected this biographical link, yet he nevertheless regarded himself like a radio, as a receiver and transmitter of supraterrestrial vibrations, and as such a mouthpiece of the divine. Stockhausen is hardly alone in this view of compositional creativity, as you can see. But all of this was lost on the culture show's Lawrence Pollard, who tried instead throughout the interview to bring up Stockhausen's influence on popular music. He hoped to flag up a photo of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper cover on which the composer stands on the back row, here. Stockhausen has been cited many times by artists and journalists as an inspiration for a range of popular music. Stockhausen, by the way, prefers the term commercial music in contrast to his art music. I would say that the most obvious connection of this kind is that between Stockhausen's Hymnum and John Lennon's Revolution No. 9 on the Beatles' White Album of 1968. But let's not get carried away with this notion of influence. Here's what Roger Waters of the band Pink Floyd told us. I'm saying that with great confidence,
We were very aware of Stockhausen, and because it was very much to our advantage to pretend some allegiance. I never liked Stockhausen's work at all, or John Cage's, and I don't think anybody else in the band did either. But it was advantageous at the time, I think, to... I know, this all sounds terribly dishonest. It wasn't quite as dishonest as this is sounding, but it was... I think we were in it for what we could get out of it in terms of kind of cultural acceptability.
Roger Waters, bass player of Pink Floyd, being candid.
None of us could really play the instruments at all, and so we had to experiment a bit because, you know, we couldn't play Beatles songs, you know, we couldn't work out the chord structures. It's how do you entertain a room full of people when you can't really play your instruments? You have to do it with some kind of theatrical device or by some other means. And it's much easier to hold down a chord, you know, and put your foot on a wah-wah pedal and, you know, swoop through the frequencies or something kind of nondescript like that than it is to play Jimmy Smith Runs on a Hammond or... But personally, I would rather have been Jimi Hendrix, given my choice. Yeah.
Roger Waters. And here's Erwin Schmidt, co-founder of the German krautrock, terrible name, krautrock group, Can, who started out as a student of Stockhausen in the late 1960s.
He was a very personal teacher, so he had a small group and he really cared for everybody. But when he said it's like this, I mean, there didn't have to be any doubt about it, because he didn't like doubts about what he said at that time. So it killed a lot of spontaneity, because you always thought you're not good enough. And when I founded Can, actually, it was in a way a sort of revolution against the line of Stockhausen and Boulez. My reaction was very immediate and it was very drastic. I founded a rap group.
Meanwhile, Holger Schute at Can told me of Stockhausen's involuntary support of rock music.
When Stockhausen left his studio and went home, I had the key and get up and switched on everything and produced there my first album in his studio, and he doesn't know it even today. I have never told him that. And when he came back from home, the machines were still warm, and I was gone out. When I was in the studio there, I wanted to know all the buttons. Where's the main switch? Where's this? Where's this? Oh yeah, that was good. A lot of paper came from the electronic studio and scissors secretly taken away. And without all these materials, we would have never succeeded with one album.
It's often claimed that Kraftwerk were taught by Stockhausen. This is incorrect. It comes from a misunderstanding about the rival 60s art scenes in Dusseldorf and Cologne. The scene in Dusseldorf involved the modernist architect Paul Schneider-Esleben, who was the father of Kraftwerk's Florian Schneider. A lively scene in Cologne centered around Stockhausen's partner Mary Bauermeister. The early Kraftwerk duo of Ralph and Florian made little parodies of the earnest electronic scene in Cologne. Here's a short example from 1971 where Ralph and Florian turn classic electronic abstract sounds into bomb raid aeroplanes. There were explicit personal connections between Stockhausen and artists in the worlds of rock and jazz, with Phil Lesh of the Grateful Dead and the jazz trumpeter Miles Davis, for instance, especially when Stockhausen visited the United States and Mexico. But to Stockhausen's mind, the static nature of much commercial music, with its repetitions and drones, weakened whatever intellectual distinction it might offer. The New York band The Velvet Underground believed that they could mesmerize an audience into a psychedelic state by playing drones. In this way, they were motivated by the experimental composer Lamont Young. Here's John Cale of The Velvet Underground talking to me about this, followed by Lamont Young.
There is a very strong psychedelic element in sustained sound, which is what we have. We would sustain chords for about an hour and a half. So we thought that putting viola behind guitars and using echo was one way of creating this enormous space that would be kind of orchestral.
When John came over, he had this Leonard Bernstein fellowship, and he went to Tanglewood, and I guess he got a little bit bored with the academic situation, and he asked John Cage, you know, what should he do? And John Cage said, well, why don't you go work with Lamont Young? And John came, and I immediately recognized that John was very talented, and I asked him to play viola in my group, and I think he hadn't even been playing viola that much. I'm not positive anymore, but I encouraged it because I was working with sustained tones, and I was especially interested in instruments that could sustain tones and tune. The one thing that was very clearly there was these long sustained drones, which John then gradually introduced to the Velvets.
Young, in turn, inspired Stockhausen in Stimmung, for example. The standpoint of the two about the impact of drones was quite similar to Young in a more positive way than to Stockhausen. This helps to explain Stockhausen's comments that I'm shortly to play you in his reaction to pieces by the electronic artists Aphex Twin and Plastic Man. A more recent conversation between Stockhausen and the Icelandic artist Björk has been remarkable. In her attempts through music to integrate digital technology and nature, Björk corresponds somewhat to Stockhausen's own ideology. Following his death, she wrote of him, quote, that where he turned electricity into sound, and it showed the rest of us. When he did this, he sparked off a sun that is still burning and will glow for a long time. By her words, Björk appears to have understood something of the cosmological aspirations of Stockhausen. Few do, yet this issue lies at the heart of Talk's subtitle about understanding or misunderstanding Stockhausen. A while ago I went to a lecture on Stockhausen at a Catholic university. The composer's interest in cosmology was dismissed with an embarrassed chuckle and a wave of the hand. Well, I thought this was nonsense. I'm an atheist. I see little difference between the Tweedledum of Catholic fairy tales and the Tweedledee of Urantian fairy tales. But Stockhausen could, because he moved from one to the other. The Urantian cosmology is central to Licht and Klang and the other works of his, yet you hardly ever hear about it. In an article on Licht, Robin McConey cites as influences the Wizard of Oz, King Arthur, Star Trek, pre-literate medieval culture, Superman, and the Hadron Collider. But not the Book of Urantia, the text through which Stockhausen followed his faith precepts since the early 70s. Sorry to say 1970s now, shouldn't I say? Meanwhile, the BBC will give time and time again for James Macmillan to promote his despotic Catholic doctrine. But Urantia is laughed off the air as a deluded cult. To my eyes and ears, they're all deluded cults. But I can't see why an interesting composer like Stockhausen should be denied an ideological platform from than a more derivative composer that composer gets with every BBC commissioned concert and programme note. Urantia combines spirituality and science. It's one of several post-war syncretic faith movements that have harnessed together biology, mathematics and astronomy with metaphysics and mythology in order to create esoteric faiths. They generally appeal to the technologically minded amongst us. Scientology is perhaps a less benign version of this sci-fi syncretism. Stockhausen became involved with the Urantia project around the same time that fellow artists in the late 1960s were so suffused with utopian hippie ethos that they entered spiritual circles. I'm thinking, for instance, of the jazz composer Sun Ra, the transcendentalism of Beatle George Harrison and Lamont Young, or the reported role of the classical conductor Michel Tabachnik in the Order of the Solar Temple. Stockhausen's involvement with the Urantia movement was not a fad, but a consistent trait of his, lasting the 3 decades up to his death in 2007. I need to add here that Kontakte, which you're shortly to experience, was composed in 1960, way in advance of the Urantia project. But I'm concerned more generally tonight with Stockhausen's vocabulary for popular music. Here is the Urantia symbol, the Urantia emblem, of azure circles, 3 azure circles. Here is the reverse of Stockhausen's grave, carved with the azure symbol. And if you seek a connection with Kontakte, by the way, look out for the tam-tam. Unlike some Christianity, Urantian thought embraces the Darwinian principle of evolution. Followers Followers consider that a progression of spiritual consciousness is a recurrent evolutionary impulse. This particular sense of evolution guides Stockhausens' judgment on popular music. He looks on it as a rudimentary phase, locked into the muscle rhythms of our physical body. He thought that gesture and dance lay at the origin of music, and he liked dancing. But our consciousness should evolve, he said, although through intellectual effort, not physical effort, in order to, quote, expand our ability to make distinctions between different durations. This explains something of his attitude and vocabulary which we're about to hear. Here's a statement from Stockhausen. There is an evolution in the language of music in Europe which leads from very simple periodic rhythms to more and more irregular rhythms. So I am careful with music which emphasizes this kind of minimalistic periodicity, because that brings out the most basic feelings and the most basic impulses in every person. When I say basic, that means the physical. We are about to hear more specific comments of his. They came about because of a radio series I presented in 1995, put together by the brilliant producer Lizzie Jackson for her company Soundbite, commissioned by BBC Radio 3. The series of 5 programs was centered on Stockhausen. It was aimed at a young audience. I was well aware that a number of sound artists said they were influenced by his work, but I was uncertain whether they were using Stockhausen's name in the same way that Pink Floyd had 2 decades before. You certainly couldn't hear it in the music they made, which was rather foursquare, somberly restrained, and rooted in modality. So we invited 6 of them to choose 5 minutes each of their music that they supposed would interest Stockhausen. And we would send them to him and record a reaction. 4 eventually managed to do this by the deadline. Richard James, who goes by the name of Aphex Twin, Richie Horton, known as Plastic Man, Robin Rambo, who goes by the name of Scanner. Each of these sobriquets inferring blurring a line between man and machine. And fourthly, Daniel Pemberton, who goes by the name of Daniel Pemberton. Daniel was at that time 17 years old. As part of the deal, they knew that I would ask Stockhausen to suggest a work of his that they might listen to as a reference to their own output. It annoyed me when this was later turned around by the magazine Wire, who suggested that Stockhausen's advice revealed his condescension, when in fact, if any hubris was being exposed, it was that of the other parties. We visited Stockhausen at the Southbank Festival, where he was giving hymn with members of his family also performing. For this reason, there were a lot of grandchildren around, and we got the impression that one or more of them had listened with him to these 4 tracks. I must add that for the series, I asked Stockhausen first about his early career, about how he started out on the composing path. He answered this with great care, and I thought we would never get off the ground. But I'm pleased to say that his account has subsequently been used by in a number of books and journals. The first artist that Stockhausen had listened to was Aphex Twin, the most publicly well-known of the quartet. Although I have a direct recording of the interview, I will play you it as it was transmitted on air, because the music that Stockhausen heard is helpfully embedded in the final version.
I heard the piece of Aphex Twin, as he said in this recording. I think
it would be very helpful if he listens to my work, Song of the Youth, which is electronic music, and a young boy's voice singing with himself, because he would then immediately stop with all these post-African repetitions, and he would look for changing tempi and for changing rhythms, and he would not allow to repeat any rhythm if it were varied to some extent, and if it did not have a direction in its sequence of variations.
A number of journalists subsequently dwelt on this singular phrase, post-African repetitions. In fact, in saying it, Stockhausen created a new marketing subgenre. Here's Last.fm's webpage, which is dedicated to it. However, while the term post-black has been taken up in North America in relation to African American artists, I can only relate Stockhausen's terms to the Urantian notion of the indigo people who possessed the continent of Africa and maintained positive bodily forms, maintained primitive bodily forms of worship. Stockhausen extends his thoughts on dance music in his comments on the Canadian artist Plastic Man. You'll notice here a tie-in with the beliefs of John Cale and Lamont Young that I flagged up earlier on drones.
And the other composer or musician, I don't know if they call themselves
they call themselves sound artists.
Yeah, sound artists. No, technocrats you call them. He's called Plastic Man, Richie Houghton. It starts with, I don't know, about 30 or 40, I haven't counted them, fifths in parallel, always the same perfect fifths, you see, changing from one to the next, and then come hundreds of repetitions of one small section of an African rhythm, etc. And I think it would be helpful if you would listen to Cycle for Percussions, which is only a 15-minute long piece of mine for a percussionist, but there he will have a hell to understand the rhythms, and I think he will get a taste for very interesting non-metric and non-periodic rhythms. I know that he wants to have a special effect in dancing bars or wherever it is on the public who like to dream away with such repetitions, but he should be very careful for this, because this public will sell him out immediately for something else if a new kind of musical drug is on the market. So he should be very careful and separate as soon as possible from belief in this kind of public.
Stockhausen's comments on the... By the way, he's doing this in a beautiful garden in a church in Salzburg. And he's not reading from notes or anything, he's just sort of staring at my tape machine. Stockhausen's comments on the third artist, Scanner, irritate me slightly because Robin has dined well off Stockhausen's words, very experimental. Whereas I feel that Stockhausen was considering Scanner to be experimental in comparison to the other three in his ingenious use of a scanning device to pick up at random mobile phone conversations. Here's Stockhausen's comments.
The other is Robin Rambo, Scanner, I've heard, with radio noises. He is very experimental because he is searching in a realm of sound which is not usually used for music. I think he should transform more what he finds. He leaves it too much in a raw state. He has a good sense for atmosphere, but he's too repetitive again. So let him listen to hymnen. My word hymnen. There are found objects, a lot, like he finds with his scanner, you see. But I think he should learn the art of transformation so that what you find sounds completely new, as I sometimes say, like an apple on the moon.
Finally, young Daniel Pemberton, who's known for that. At the time, he was a 17-year-old who had achieved some success with his debut album, Bedroom, which it was indeed composed in his bedroom. Daniel is now known for supplying music to films such as King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, and Spider-Man, Across the Spider-Verse. Here are Stockhausen's thoughts on the 17-year-old.
Then there's Daniel Pemberton, and his work, which I heard, has noise loops. So he likes loops, the loop effect, like in Musique Concrète, where I worked in 1952, and all Henri and Schaeffer himself, they found some sounds, like say sounds of a casserole, and they made a loop, and then they transposed this loop. So I think he should give up this loop. It is too old-fashioned, really. He likes train rhythms, and I think when he comes to a soft spot, to a quiet spot, his harmony sounds, to my ears, really like ice cream harmony. It is so kitschy, and he should stay away from these ninths and sevenths and, how do you say, tenths, impero. So look for a harmony which sounds new and which sounds like Pemberton and not like anything else. So he should listen to Kontakte, which has, among my works, the largest scale of harmonic, unusual and very, how can I say, demanding harmonic relationships. So I like to tell the musicians that they should learn from works which have refused to give in to these fashionable temptations.
The Independent newspaper took the interview up as a print feature. The Monthly Wire magazine borrowed that, giving it the inane title, Advice to Clever Children. Up to that point, no one had used the word clever or children in the exercise. But Wire expanded it by asking the four sound artists to respond to Stockhausen, which they did through direct retaliation. Aphex Twin suggested that Stockhausen should listen to a couple of his tracks, and then the old man would ditch all those complicated, irrational rhythms. However, Stockhausen's comments did seem to make an impact on him. Here he is talking a little later.
Part of AZ, I just wanted to make music that sounded different and wasn't like anything else that I'd heard before.
Well, who'd have guessed it? In summary, the difference of opinion between the 67-year-old and the 20-somethings may be considered to be that model disparity between modernism and neoclassicism or postmodernism. But this lets the sound artists get away with too much. They have claimed association with a leading figure of a particular compositional aesthetic and methodology in order to secure subcultural capital. Stockhausen is one name among many, like John Cage, Pierre Schaeffer, Yanis Xenakis, of whom they claim ascendancy to as part of the subcultural game that overwhelms them. So let's allow the late Stockhausen to meet them halfway. Let him play in the game too. Let us assume he has listened to Aphex Twin again and found inspiration. Earthlings, beyond techno lies Stockno, a sound world pioneered by the humorist Graham Duff. Stockno sounds like this. I leave you to decide how successful Stockno will become, or as Stockhausen would put it,
Kijk wat voor schönes je dansen opbrengen.
thank you.